Hear that? Holy crap. I'm pretty sure that's a Bigfoot. Let me tell you a story. Welcome to Season 2. Welcome to another edition of Bigfoot Campfire Stories. Many times during the holidays, with so many people in the forest, strange happenings are reported. And Jake and his brother Jesse, while they were on their vacation near Mount St. Helens, Washington, had a little adventure of their own. Let's hear their story. Well, our parents, as usual, decided that they had been going to head to the ocean for the 4th of July holiday. My brother Jesse and I couldn't stand the thought of yet another boring adventure with the folks at the beach. This summer, instead, Jesse was turning 16, 4 years younger than I, and it was time that I saved him from the family vacation, and we started an adventure of our own. After weeks of looking at locations we could get to from Seattle in the time that we had, we settled on a deep forest location. Jesse, always being the Boy Scout, actually kind of a cool kid, he's been working towards his Eagle Scout for years now, must be prepared, sought out the most remote, safe location he could, and settled on Lower Falls Campground near Mount St. Helens. I had never heard of such a place, so Jesse took me on a little Google Earth tour of the place, and for being so far out in the middle of nowhere, it had a lot of decent roads to get there, and even a bathroom to use. Good enough for me. The location and the week were set. Now to get some gear put together, and we'll be all set. For the next 10 days, Jesse hit every thrift store, yard sale, and pawn shop he could find to put together all the gear we would need on the cheap. And I have to say, a full set of camping gear was had for the total bill of $87.62, and that included a working chainsaw and some other odd items he'd picked up. Just 5 more days until we leave on our adventure, and I just couldn't wait. Finally, Friday morning had arrived, and before daybreak, Jesse had gotten up and packed the entire gear set into the truck. He was standing there waiting for me, coffee in hand, just rearing to go at 6 a.m. We honked and waved to Mom and Dad as we drove out of the driveway, bound for Lower Falls Campground. We'd been driving for about 3 hours when Mount St. Helens was starting to get pretty big in the window, and our camp was only 90 minutes in further down into the forest. Jesse had been taking video with his new setup he bought for $25 at a yard sale. It was a 12-megapixel Canon camera with a 35 optical zoom. He swears you can see a flea on a dog's butt at 30 yards. He says he's going to document the entire trip since it was the first time without the parents. We stopped and filled up the gas tank at what seemed to be the last chance gas stop and grabbed some body fuel and headed out into the forest. For the next weekend, I thought we would be roughing it camping. We arrived at Lower Falls Campground about noon that Friday. I was excited to see that there were real paved roads leading in and out of the area, many of the locations that we wanted to check out. Even the dirt forest roads were maintained enough for our 2x4 truck should have no issue getting in and out of anywhere. As we pulled up to the pay station and looked at the map, this place was huge, and it was quite well used, as there were many campers and tents set up when we got there. Lucky enough, there were still plenty of sites open, so we claimed our spot, and Jesse went on a whirlwind to get camp set up. By 2 p.m., our camp was all set. He had found a nice big cowboy-type pole tent with a couple of cots at a yard sale for $30. I was amazed that all of the parts were actually there, and the cots were actually comfy. He was over splitting some firework before I realized we hadn't eaten all day. Well, I looked over at the picnic table, and sure enough, there sat a small Coleman stove all set up and ready to make some lunch. Well, we weren't gourmet at this point, so I heated up some Chef Boyardee and fed us before we set off on our first hike. This time of year, the sun doesn't really set until after 8 o'clock, so we had many hours of daylight to burn, and I was really interested in seeing the swimming area down by the falls, so we went down the hiking trail, grabbed our towels, and set off. A short 20-minute walk later, and sure enough, the forest emerged to Lower Lewis River Falls, and the clearest water I think I've ever seen. Quite a few people were bathing and sunning themselves. It was really hot this time of year, and Jessie was off, jumping from a rock before I knew it, only to emerge from what I could assume was sub-60-degree water. It was like a million nails had struck his skin, and many of the surrounding people kind of chuckled. Sure enough, as I approached the water, it was very, very cold. But as hot as it was outside, a quick dip is most definitely in order, so under the surface I went. I opened my eyes as I swam along, noticing small fish and other critters around the water. It was a very healthy ecosystem. Surely bigger fish must be in the rivers, but as most things fun, the sun was starting to set, and it was time to get back to camp before dark. It had seemed that everyone was packing up at the same time, like a mass exodus of the area. I'd heard some locals talking as they were heading towards another trail. Something about if all those campers really knew what was out here after dark, none of them would be laughing. But I thought I must have been mistaken and just wrote it off as folklore. We had gotten back to camp, and Jessie set off to make a fire so we could get some good food cooking. It wasn't long before we had some good coals to cook over, so we lowered the grate onto the pit and put some brats and soup onto the fire. While we sat and ate, Jessie was all quiet. I finally asked him what was wrong, and he looked over at me and asked what I thought about Bigfoot. Bigfoot? I asked back. Well, I thought for a moment on giving him an honest answer. I said I've never seen anything that would make me think that Bigfoot couldn't exist. But then again, I've never seen or met anyone that has ever seen one either. Why do you ask? Well, Jessie had said that while up at the falls, he had talked to some of the locals, and they'd kind of warned him about the Lewis River monster. They said it was some kind of an ape man that lived among the Lewis River area and around the dead volcano. Had been known to harass and even kidnap campers in the area. Of course, I figured that they were just trying to scare us, but I checked my phone and did a search, and sure enough, there's a page that talks a whole lot about Bigfoot sightings right around where we are, right here. And then there's this. He handed me this weird animal bone horn of some type. Well, Jessie explained that while getting the camping gear and talking to people about where we were going, he met this old guy at a yard sale that just gave him this horn and said it was a wild man call. Well, I looked at Jessie with that look that we all know as he just stared right back at me and said, yeah, I know, a wild man call. Wow, what could I say to that? I'll tell you what, Jessie, we'll go for a long hike tomorrow and we'll test out the theory on this wild man call. But for now, I think I'm going to go to bed. Jessie said he would sit by the fire for a bit and then join me, so off to the tent I went. Well, it wasn't until about 2:30 in the morning when I woke up to the most awful sound I think I had ever heard. It sounded like an elk bugle mixed with a seal bark and a screaming woman, all piercing right to the base of your eardrum. I looked to the other cot, and Jessie was nowhere to be found, so I walked out to the tent, only to find him sitting by the fire with that "oh crap, I got caught" look on his face. Other campers coming out to find out what that noise was as well. He admitted it was him blowing on that wild man call, but he said, I only barely blew into it. Really, barely. I won't be doing that again. I'm so sorry. Well, it wasn't long before everything settled back down, and I brought Jessie into the tent, and we went on to bed. The next morning, there was a rustling around the campers. It seemed something around 6 a.m. Some large animal was seen running in the tree line near the hiking trails. They said it looked to be running on 4 legs, but it was so fast that the people that saw it really couldn't tell what it was. Jessie, all excited, looked at me and just whispers, maybe it was a wild man or a Bigfoot. I just wanted to smack him in the back of the head to bring him back to reality. More likely, it was a black bear. Well, we decided we would take a long hike this morning, and it was going to be some 11 miles round trip, so packs and first aid kits were a must. And sure enough, Jessie brought that wild man call, now affixed around his neck with some paracord. We had hiked pretty deep into the trail, about an hour and a half, before I had heard that same sound again. Well, I quickly turned around to find Jessie frozen in place, and the call nowhere near his lips. He swore he hadn't touched it, and then we both heard that same sound again from much further off in the distance. and then a loud movement of noise from the tree line, and something took off. I figured it couldn't possibly be what called them, but I told Jesse to blow on that horn and see, and do it loud. Well, Jesse filled up his lungs with air and blew into that horn as loud and as hard as he could. At first we heard nothing at all, but as the air slowed down, that elk squelch scream started again and continues until Jesse ran out of breath. My ears rang so bad I could barely think. I could barely even hear Jesse's voice as he spoke to me, but his hearing wasn't affected at all as he was behind the horn. It seemed like what had only been seconds, but he said the sounds were returned with some sort of weird whoop, and he pulled my arm to go back the way that we had came, in the opposite directions of where the sounds had come. So we quickly went that way. We knew it was at least a 90-minute hike back to camp, and it must have been at least 20 minutes until my ears stopped ringing and I could start to hear normally again. Well, that's when Jesse started to ask questions about what I thought they were. Of course, neither of us saw what made the calls. It certainly wasn't anything we had ever heard of or read anywhere. The more we walked along, the more we realized the lack of any other sounds. We stopped for a moment to drink some water, and again it was dead silent. Every time we moved, something in the shadow line seemed to move with us. It was like we were being shadowed by some special forces or ninja. This was starting to feel really creepy, so we quickened our pace. We never caught a sight of what was following us, but whatever it was could see from a far distance, as it would wait for a long time till we were almost out of sight, and then it would catch up. So we quickened our pace once more. Finally, the end of the trail could be seen. No sight or sound of whatever was following us for quite some time now. Maybe we had actually lost it. By the time we reached the end of the trail, what seemed to be a problem became something very strange. It was the fact that now it was already 3:45 in the afternoon. That can't possibly be the case, but there you have it. Jesse and I had hit the trail at 8 a.m. We had traveled no more than 90 minutes in, and again 90 minutes back out to the trailhead. That should make it no later than 11 a.m., maybe noon at the latest. But here we are, and it's 3:45 p.m. I don't remember looking at my watch, to be honest. After the ringing stopped in my ears, we just headed straight back. Where did that extra 3 hours go? Just made no sense at all. We went straight back to camp and decided to grab a bite and head up to the swimming area to see if anyone had heard those weird noises. Well, after a fast sandwich, Jesse and I headed up to the falls trail to see if there's anyone else around. When we arrived there was just a few swimmers, and one creepy old man left taking pictures. We didn't bother the kids, and while Jesse jumped in for a dip, I sought out that old man taking pictures to see if he had known anything about it. I started out by asking if he minded an odd question, at which he replied to, "Shoot." So I just blurted it out. "Have you heard any really weird screams or stories of people losing time in the forest here?" And the man turned and looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Sounds like the cross between a screaming woman and an elk bugle." And then lowered his gaze and says, "No, I've never heard anything like that," and turned to walk away. Well, that's when I realized he had described the sound, not me. So I grabbed him by the arm and asked him to tell me the truth, and then called Jesse over to witness as well. The moment Jesse walked over, the stranger's eyes kind of went straight as he gazed to that stupid horn thing that was now seemingly affixed around Jesse's neck. The man said his name was Peter, and he lived not far from here. He'd been researching the Lewis River monster since he had moved to the area 6 years ago. News had gotten back to him that the screams had returned to the falls, so he came over to poke around. Well, we told him what happened to us today on the hiking trail, and that we had heard the screams, and then Jesse had blown the horn extremely loud, and we both lost 3 hours in the forest. Jesse actually interrupted me to tell that, truthfully, it was only me that had lost the time. In fact, he had spent those hours trying to bring me back to reality, as once he had blown the horn, I started to mumble in some kind of a strange tongue. It made no sense for him for all that time, It wasn't until I started to speak English again that Jesse thought I might be okay after all. Pete just sat there and listened as Jesse told us both the story of what happened while I was lost in the horn. Jesse said that the screams had honed in on the call. Several of them had called back and forth until you could hear that they were actually communicating side by side. They stood in the tree line just in the shadows and watched us, calling out as if they wanted me to blow the horn again. But after what had happened to me, he dare not blow it again. The creatures had started to come closer when I started to come out of my stupor, and then the creatures slid back into the shadows, and that's who actually followed us out of the forest until they dare not go any further. Well, Peter had asked just where Jesse had gotten that horn call, and we told him the story of the old man just gave it to him at the yard sale in Seattle, once he had heard we were coming to the Lewis River area. Jesse said the old man kind of laughed when he said it would call in the wild man, and then didn't say any more, but wild man. And Peter took some detailed photos of the horn and asked if we would part with it, to which we responded, no, thank you. It seemed there might be a bit more to this horn thing that we don't know at the moment. Peter then said he had to go and wished us luck, although he did offer once more to buy the horn from us. He said you'd be better off selling it to me and going home, but to each their own, and he walked away down the trail, bound for the parking outside of the camp. We had stayed way too long at the falls talking with Peter, and now the sun was gone as we headed back to camp. That 20-minute walk seemed to take forever, but we finally made it back to the campground. This being Saturday night, many of the sites were now empty. It was just us and two other campers that had big RVs set up, but no one seemed to be at them. It seemed odd that what started out as a very busy campground now seems to be a ghost town. Well, Jesse got the fire started up once more, and we cooked up some food on the fire. It wasn't until about 11 o'clock when Jesse looked and asked if I was planning on going to sleep. After the day we had had, I wasn't too sure laying down and closing my eyes was something I really wanted to do, but I was just too drained. I just asked that he come into the tent with me and hang out so I didn't have to worry about him. So we pulled the logs off the coals and settled inside the tent. We were laying there in our cots just bantering back and forth. It must have been about 1 a.m. We laughed about how unboring this trip had been so far and could only imagine about how our minds would have been just so bored at the beach. And then I kind of drifted off to sleep. I kept waking up nearly every hour with a panic as if Jesse would be gone, and he was sound asleep in his cot each time. A couple of more hours passed, and I was being shaken awake by Jesse. He whispered, "They are here. They're here, and I can hear them in the woods. Over there. They're talking. Wake up, they're here." Finally awake and sitting up, I started to focus on the sounds coming from the woods behind us, and surely it sounded like soft bugling and screeching going on. Not 10 seconds later, they were much closer, and 10 seconds after that, they were right next to the tent. And then the shadow of a hand rises up so tall, it starts to move down the wall sides of the tent. You could actually see the fingers as they indented the fabric on the side. Well, that's it. I freaked out and shouted for Jesse to get out of the tent, run to the truck, and lock the doors once he was inside. I stood up first and busted through the tent door. I blocked the area between them and Jesse, and he had ran behind me. I could barely see them as dark as it was, but they were tall, very tall, all covered in hair, not wearing any clothes, no animal skins, no jewelry, no nothing. I stared at both a male and a female as they gibbered back and forth, and that was when the male took a deep breath and screamed directly at me. Well, my ears began to ring. I hadn't passed out, but I had staggered back, and against what I told him, Jesse came back from behind me, stepped forward, and blasted on his horn just as loud as he could. The creatures immediately stopped. They grabbed their ears and actually ran for the forest as fast as they could. My ears had actually recovered much faster this time, as the level had not been anything near as loud, and Jesse had blown his call. He was actually in front of me. Just a few moments has passed, and we stood there in shock until we heard many of those elk bugle screeches, and that was enough for us. We ran for the truck, leaving everything behind, started up, and tore out of the sight. Pushed our truck just as fast as it would go until we reached the main road. Still being so dark, once we left the camp, there was no light to be had but the headlights of the truck. We didn't look back, not once. I drove that same 90 minutes out of the forest before any real signs of civilizations came once more. Just as the sun was coming up, we both kind of breathed a sigh of relief. I looked over to watch Jesse staring at the horn in one hand and a pair of channel locks in the other. I asked him what he was doing. Well, he grabbed the horn in the pliers and crushed a giant hole in one side of it. Crushed it again and again until it nearly fell apart. I told him that he had just destroyed the one thing that could have proven our story. He looked at me dead in the face and said, "I don't ever want to speak about this again to anyone ever, including you." And the rest of the drive home was pretty silent. We'd arrived home much earlier than our parents, and Jesse just laid in his room until long after dark. Mom had called us down to find out about our trip, to which Jesse just replied, "It was camping, Mom. A lot of staring at the fire and swimming in the falls. I'll show you pictures tomorrow. I'm really beat." And he turned and walked back up the stairs. I sat with Mom and heard all about the beach trip with Dad, and all while thinking what I was going to say about our trip. And when the time came, I looked at her right in her eyes and said, "It was camping, Mom. A lot of staring at the fire and swimming in the falls. I'm really beat. I'll show you pictures in the morning." And I turned and went to bed too. Neither of us ever spoke about that trip, not even to each other, until just now. Jack and Jesse never again went camping together. While both the guys had grown apart, the beach trips were far more inviting than trips to the forest would ever be. Thanks for listening. I'm Reverend Jeff, and may the Squatch be with you.